Hey folks, let me do this right quick here, but just as a summary. So we talked a little bit about Rocza Korczak's background. So now we're going to be talking more about the meeting between her and Vitka Kempner and Abba Kovner. This is going to round out the trilogy of the main three people that the book is going to be reviewing. So I just wanted to give that update, and with that, let's go ahead and do some more reading. One morning, Riska was stirring in the courtyard reading a book called Essays on Socialist Zionism. A young girl walked up to her. She was about 20, the same age as Riska, but seemed much younger. She had a spring in her step and smiled through long lashes. Her eyes were big and dark, and her brown hair hung over her shoulders. "What are you reading?" she asks. Riska held up the book. Why such a serious book? The world is a serious place," said Riska. "I think the world is not so serious," said the girl. "Do you see where we are living?" The girl looked across the teeming courtyard to the brick building laundry hanging from the windows. "Okay, so if the world is serious, all the more reason not to read a serious book. What do you read?" asked Riska. The girl said she had read all the Russians, but her favorite book was The Count of Monte Cristo. "What's your name?" asked Riska. "Vitka Kempner." Riska and Vitka were at once attracted to each other, brought together by their differences. Vitka was drawn to the character of Riska, her integrity, her humility, and her strength. In Vitka, Riska found the youth she had lost, the fun of childhood. Vitka's silliness was not just frivolous, but a kind of philosophy, a response to a situation that was absurd, a determination by a young girl who had already been robbed of home, family, freedom, not to be robbed of life. Ruska and Vitka shared a bed, sat in the courtyard, walked in the forest. They became inseparable. One day, a strange young man came to the refugee building. He wore wool pants and a hat pulled down over his eyes. He walked the halls, glancing into each face. His hands were behind his back. He was inspecting. He stood for a time in a corner, observing, saying nothing. He was slender, with long arms and long legs. His face was dark, and his features were so soft that they were almost feminine. And yet, he exuded a certain raw power. He had big hands. Some of the young women commented on how attractive he was. Vitka did not think he was attractive, just strange. When he left, people stood together talking. "Who is he?" asked Vitka. "He is one of the leaders of the Young Guard," she was told. "His name is Abba Kovner." Ruska arrived in the city in the winter. It was now spring. In the evenings, the streets were filled with farm boys. In the fields, Ruska and Vitka walked to town. Looking south, they could see trees on a hill, and then more hills with more trees. The road ran past houses and ancient fortifications, red brick walls that once protected Vilna from invasion. Since the founding of the city, the Jewish population had been driven beyond the walls 5 times. Vitka knew the popular songs that year and sang them to Ruska. The girls talked about the country, its people, its past. Vilna had been built in the 1300s by a prince from a nearby province. Its founding myth is dark and strange. One afternoon, the prince, on a hunt, found himself in the woods along the Neris River. He killed and ate a deer. He then fell asleep, and in his sleep dreamt of a wolf in an iron mask, howling with the strength of 100 wolves. In the morning, an interpreter told the prince that the wolf represented a fortified city that would rise on this very spot. He built Vilna. It grew into the capital of Lithuania, the last country in Europe to accept Christianity. The Jews who first came to the city from Russia and Germany worked as cobblers and tinsmiths and merchants. Beginning in the 16th century, they were confined to a ghetto in the center of town, a warren of wood buildings, blind alleys. The cellars of the ghetto were 3 stories deep. Some people called them dwellings of the devil. Over time, the city gave rise to a great Jewish community, schools of scholars and holy men. In 1812, when Napoleon passed through Vilna on his doomed way to Moscow, he peered into the great synagogue where hundreds of Jews were praying and said, "Surely this is the Jerusalem of Lithuania." And that is what Jews have called Vilna ever since. By 1939, 200,000 people lived in Vilna, a third of them Jewish. It was tranquil. It was a tranquil little pocket of Europe, with war all around. Russians in the east, Germans in the south, and in the west. The streets were a stream of ancient architecture, collapsing wooden buildings, Byzantine corners and vistas of green hills, tin roofs, and brick roads curving under the streets, under the trees in the smoky twilight. The girls walked by storefront synagogues and steamy rooms where the young men argued over Trotsky and Stalin. The Jews were divided into rival factions. There were Zionists, there were Communists, there were Bundists, who believed in labor unions. There were the Orthodox, and there were the assimilated Jews, who saw themselves less as Jews than as Poles or Lithuanians or Germans. Each group had its organizations, ideas, ways of doing things. Communists distrusted Bundists, Bundists distrusted Zionists, Zionists distrusted the Orthodox, and everyone distrusted the assimilated Jews. Now and then a breeze blew on the faces of the girls, brought them the smell of the fields. The wind whistled by the river, which reflected church spires and bridges. On weekends, workmen sat on the banks with homemade fishing poles. It was dark and safe under the bridge where Rizka and Vitka shared lunch and told their stories. Vitka had recently learned by mail of her father's death. Her mother said it was a heart attack, but Vitka knew it was the war that killed him. By telling her story and sharing her feelings, Vitka understood she was giving Rizka a treasure for safekeeping.
Vitka grew up in a town in western Poland called Kalisz. Her parents were tailors. She was a Jewish girl who could pass as a non-Jew. She spoke Polish without the inflections of Yiddish. For a time she saw herself as a Polish patriot and hated everyone the Poles hated, except Jews. She hated the Germans. She hated the Russians. When she was 12, she joined Betar, a Zionist youth group that was a rival to the Young Guard. Betar was very right-wing and dedicated to a kind of holy vengeance. Its leader was Vladimir Jabotinsky, who behaved like a Jewish fascist, dressing his followers in brown shirts which symbolized the soul of Palestine. He wrote, "It is the highest achievement of a multiple of human beings to act together with the absolute precision of a machine." In Poland, Betar was led by Menachem who would later become the Prime Minister of Israel. He also led Irgun as well, but that's a whole different story. Vitka quit the group when she discovered the Count of Monte Cristo. No matter how hard she tried, she could not be gloomy. She switched to the Young Guard, and though she attended the meetings and sang the songs, she remained carefree and open-minded, unmoved by political dogma. Vitka was on her way to a simple life before the Germans marched into Poland. When the Germans invaded, Vitka, at the urging of her parents, who had other relatives to care for, took her 13-year-old brother to the woods outside of Kalisz, where they would be safe from the bombs. They planned to return in a few hours. When the bombing was over, in silence, they walked along the forest trail stamped with chain treads. Now and then, a plane passed so low it brushed the top of the trees. In the afternoon, Vitka heard the crash of boots. Crouching in the weeds, she could see German soldiers marching down the road. The eyes of the soldiers were as dull as the trunks on the trees, and their boots were splashed in the puddles. "What are you doing here?" Vitka turned quickly. A German soldier was standing over her. He was about her age, maybe 19, and she could see the short blonde hair under his helmet. "Get up," he said. He looked her up and down, and then at her brother, who had fists clenched at his sides. "Running will do you no good," said the soldier. "Your boys are very beautiful on their horses, but they don't stand a chance. We are the strongest country in the world. You are lucky," he went on. "We are the army. We are nice. But after us will come the SS, and then you will know what Germany is." A few hours later, Vitka and her brother were at home in their beds. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the Nazi invasion, the SS issued an order in Kalisz. The town, not far from the German border, was in that part of Poland that was to become Judenrein, Jew-free. The entire Jewish population of 3,000 ordered to assemble the next day in an abandoned church. That morning, Vitka's parents went to town for news. Vitka waited at home all afternoon. Her parents did not return. In the evening, there was a knock on the door. Two soldiers told Vitka to gather her things. They took her to the church, where she met her family and every other Jew from town, rich and poor, believers and atheists, friends and enemies, people who would not have said hello to each other the day before. A Nazi paced before them, cursing and accusing. For Vitka, worse than anything was having to stand in that face of this man's rage. He yelled at me, she later said. That I did not like at all. Vitka told her parents that she was leaving and taking her 13-year-old brother. Her father said go, believing they would soon be together again. She made her way through the crowd to a bathroom. She opened the window and climbed out, pulling her brother after her. Skirting patrols through the dark countryside, they walked to their grandfather's house in the next town. The old man told Vitka to continue on, away from the war. But your brother is too young, he said. Your brother stays here. In 4 weeks, Vitka was in Vilna. That spring, Ruska and Vitka took a room in a private house in the city. It had once been a grand estate, and there were still sockets for chandeliers and a carved mantel over the fireplace, but the girls were there on the cheap, with dozens of other refugees sleeping on floors in halls and bathrooms. The girls soon found in a hairbrush factory.
Vitka separated dark bristles from light bristles. Ruska worked in the yard in the rain and snow, scrubbing the bristles clean. By the end of each day, the water had soaked into her shoes, her socks were wet. Her toes were numb, and her teeth chattered. The girls did not need to work. Food and shelter were supplied by the young guard, but work was part of their philosophy. Without work, a person can have no self-respect. What money they made was given to the group to fund trips to Palestine. On June 15, 1940, the Russians marched on Vilna. It would be wrong to say that they attacked Vilna. They did not need to. They just walked in. A move in the geopolitical game that Stalin was playing with Hitler. Paris had fallen to the Germans a few days before. Stalin was now scrambling for what remained of the East, the staging grounds and buffer zones of what the realists knew would be the next front in the war. The Russians dissolved the government and seized the radio stations. Soviet troops could be seen on the trains and buses, in restaurants and bars. Drinking up their leave, they exuded the brutality of the steppes. The Russians outlawed Zionist groups, which they said challenged Soviet sovereignty. The young guard and Batar went underground, learning to operate from basements and secret rooms, a step ahead of the law. Stalin ordered all refugees to apply for Soviet citizenship. The Zionist groups held meetings. Arguments raged. If Jews became Soviet citizens, they would no longer be refugees. If they were not refugees, they were not eligible for certificates to emigrate to Palestine. But if Jewish refugees did not become Soviet citizens, they would be arrested by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. Most Zionists decided to refuse Soviet citizenship, steer clear of soldiers, hope for the best. In the following weeks, dozens of Jews were caught, tried, and sent to Siberia. Menachem Begin was among those shipped east. These seemed terrible at the time, but turned out to be a blessing, Vitka said. Those who were sent to Russia survived the war. A friend at the police station told Vitka that her name was on an NKVD arrest list. She quickly dropped out of sight, spending day after day in her room. In June of 1941, after weeks of fighting, she told Ruska, "I want to be free. I want to go walking." She packed a bag and fixed her hair in the mirror. "Where will you go?" asked Ruska. "Bielorussia," said Vitka. "They cannot have my name in Bielorussia. Who am I? Why shouldn't they bother with me?" "I'll write when it's okay to come back," said Ruska. Vitka threw her bag over her shoulder and looked at Ruska, who was sitting on the bed. Vitka had known Ruska just over a year, but already felt for her something more than love. "What then?" asked Vitka. Ruska smiled. "Then we go to Palestine." Ruska was startled by the air raid siren. She was reading a book on the grass in front of the apartment house. It was a breezy Sunday morning. Vitka had left the city a week before. The stores were closed, the streets were empty. Ruska looked into a perfect blue sky, not a cloud. She could hear birds in the trees. Then she saw German planes fly above the fields. She stood as they passed by, and for a moment she was in their shadow, and she heard the blare of engines, and felt as if she were in the wake of a great ship. The planes went over the city, and she could hear explosions by the airport. At 11 a.m., the Soviet foreign minister came on the radio and said that the Germans had attacked 7 hours before. The enemy was crossing the Niemen River on their way to Vilna. The streets were filled with cars leaving town. In the cars were the dolled-up wives of Russian officers. Troop trucks were loaded in the city squares. As the trucks climbed into the hills, soldiers hung from the back, cigarettes in their mouths. The few soldiers who remained in Vilna took desperate that night, waving guns and demanding civilian clothes. In the morning, the city filled with new refugees speaking of the German assault of the ancient towns on fire. That afternoon, Riska started walking east. There were thousands of Jews on the road, families dragging with what little they owned. They crossed tiny bridges over streams where horses grazed. Now and then, a farmer came and gave them water. At night, German fighter planes flew over the refugees, opening up with machine guns. Dozens of people were killed on the road, others made it to the trees. When pilots flew above peasant huts, they fired their guns until the thatched roofs burst into flames. German paratroopers jumped into the woods in civilian clothes, disguised as peasants. They buried their parachutes and blended in with the refugees. The Russians quickly became aware of these enemy soldiers trying to infiltrate their lines. In the morning, the roads to the east were cut. Like most refugees, Rizka turned back. Others were stopped at the border. The streets were empty when Rizka returned to Vilna, the shutters down. It was like the quiet between storms. As she walked past the brick buildings, a lone soldier flashed by on a motorcycle. He wore leather gloves, black pants, tinted goggles, and a helmet with the iron cross. His boots were muddy. He sped down the street and out of sight. The first German she had seen in Vilna. A moment later, she heard the rumble of engines, voices, and boots. The German army marched into the city, motorcycles, then infantry, field guns, half-tracks, and tanks. The soldiers were dusty, and she could tell that they had come from a great distance. The doors of the houses flew open. The girls stood in the windows throwing down flowers, and the boys lowered colorful banners. Rizka walked home through the ancient ghetto where the poor Jews lived. The windows were shut tight, and nothing moved. Vitka had been in Grodno for a week, or for 2 weeks. She was there, and when the Germans marched through. A few days later, she heard that Vilna had been captured. She asked herself, if the Germans are there, and if the Germans are here too, why not go back to Vilna? If I have to live under the Nazis, I should be with Rizka. She threw her bag over her shoulder and walked out of the city. On the road, she saw a German soldier loading a transport truck. Where are you going? Vitka asked. She was calm and direct. I'm going to Vilna, said the soldier. He was maybe 20, and the accent of a farm boy. I'm going to Vilna too, she said. Can I have a ride? The man looked at Vitka. Are you Catholic? He asked. No, said Vitka, a Protestant. No. He let his arms fall to his sides. What are you? In her childhood, Vitka has sometimes been ashamed of her religion. She was a patriot, a Pole, and she wanted to be just like everyone else. A piece of the nation. No better, no worse. She sometimes found the past of her people a burden. It was in the back of every conversation, at the threshold of every door. But since she had seen her family rounded up, had gone on the road, had met Rizka, she had changed. She was proud of her past, of her people, of her doomed place in Nazi Europe. I am a Jew. The young soldier looked at Vitka, swallowed hard, and ran. The country boy filled with lies, stories of blood-sucking Jews, the virus, the mongrel, the origin of disease, and now alone with a Jewish girl. He got spooked. Vitka hurried into the forest. She hid there for hours from the edge of the trees. She could see into a clearing where a freight train stood on the track that went to Vilna. The boxcars were open, equipment inside. The train started to move, going slow. Vitka ran out of the trees, jogged next to an empty car, and tossed her bag through an open door and jumped in. She slid to the back of the car and looked out at the countryside. It was dark, and she could see a dark road that wound by peasant towns where life had not changed for 1,000 years. The wheat fields bent in the wind, and summer was in the air. The clacking of the rails lulled her to sleep. She dreamed of her family waiting around the table, her mother serving dinner, an empty seat where she was supposed to be. She spoke when the train yelled, "Reached Vilna." She jumped from the car and walked across the yard. Not fast, not slow, shoulders back, chin up. If you look like you know where you are going, no one stops you. That is what she believed. She was soon on the empty streets of the city. She walked by the buildings and stores. It looked the same as before. She found her way to the house where she had lived with Ruska. It was 5 a.m. She yelled, "I'm back, Ruska." A window opened. "Are you crazy? Are you trying to get killed?" Vitka's smile disappeared. "Get up here." Ruska made tea as the sun rose over the stepped roofs of the city. "You must be crazy." "Why?" "Here you are in the street before Kufri, no yellow star, and I look out and see you calmly walking along the sidewalk right on the sidewalk. Thank God you were alive." "I don't understand." "It's a law for Jews," said Ruska. "The Germans made it 2 days after they came in. It's posted all over the city. What is it?" "Everything you have done. The opposite." The Germans came to Vilna with their usual Jewish laws, the yellow star, the curfew, and the sidewalk where no Jew was allowed to walk. "So where do we walk?" said Vitka. "In the street with the animals." Vitka went to the window. People were on their way to work. "There is more," said Vriska. "Tell me." "When the SS arrived, they kidnapped 60 of the most prominent Jews in Vilna, rabbis, professors, entertainers, politicians. They said these people were taken to be certain that the Jews obeyed the law." "And if people obeyed?" "Yes, the people have obeyed, but we've never seen these men again." And then others started to disappear. A man would go off to work and never come back. Or the Germans took them from their houses, hundreds of men, vanished. "Where are they?" "The Germans said they have been resettled in the east." "What about the young guard?" asked Vitka. "What have they done?" "They have kept our men from the Germans. Some live in homes disguised as Aryans. Some are in the convent with the nuns." Vitka drank her tea. "What are you thinking?" asked Rizka. "Only that I am afraid." On September 6, 1941, Nazi soldiers fanned out across Vilna. They went to every house and apartment where a Jew was living. They knocked on doors, stood in thresholds, their boots creaked. They came early so the bewildered people could not sort their appearance from what they had dreamed the night before. Jews had 10 minutes to gather their possessions. They were being moved to a ghetto. Many put on layers and layers of clothes, 5 shirts, 4 sweaters, 3 jackets. They could bring only what they could carry. Some dragged canned goods and sacks of flour. In the streets there were thousands of Jews stumbling along with suitcases and duffel bags. The sidewalks were lined with Aryans, merchants and school kids and professionals, familiar faces. Most just watched the ribbon unfold. It was a hot summer day, and some Jews collapsed under their loads. Dishes, clothing, and photos spilled. Scavengers scrambled after them in the street. This humdrum avenue of shops and stoplights had been transformed into a tunnel of noise. Now and then a Pole jumped into the street and yelled, You wanted Palestine and you get the ghetto." The street ended at a wooden gate on the Redinka street, marked by the sign "Plague, Entry Forbidden." There was a small sign underneath: "Jews are forbidden from bringing in food and heating supplies. Violators will be shot." Beyond the grave was the ancient ghetto, the Byzantine, deep-cellar warren where Jews had been forced to live until the Middle Ages. Less than a square mile, it consisted of 6 tiny streets. Before the war, 1,000 people had lived there. There would now be 30,000. The Germans surrounded the ghetto with a tall wooden fence. The windows that looked over the fence to the free city were boarded. From one street, leaning back on your heels, you could see the top of the great synagogue. It was outside the ghetto, the peak of its golden dome, the tablets of the commandments. For the Jews of Vilna, the world had been narrowed to a few crooked houses. The streets of the ghetto were empty. Until just a few days before, it had been home to the poorest people in the city, a neighborhood of cobblers and workshops and jewelry stores. Wealthy Jews who'd go there to smell the bread in the ovens. When the Germans conquered the city, They closed the ghetto schools and synagogues and sent patrols into the streets. On August 30th, a German soldier had been shot in the ghetto. Most most likely, this is a staged act, a bit of theater, just to justify what was to follow. A German SS officer posted the following notice. Sunday afternoon, shots were directed from the ambush at German soldiers in Vilna. Two of these cowardly bandits were identified. They were Jews. The attackers paid with their lives for their act. They were shot on the spot. To avoid such hostile acts in the future, new and severe deterrent measures were taken. The responsibility lies with the entire Jewish community. Okay, before I go any further, I just wanted to say that this is the beginning of where it's gonna get kind of rough and get very, the reality is gonna come through. And I think it's just a warning here. I'm gonna cover some of the basics of it, but reading a little bit ahead, a lot of the real detailed stuff is going to be in here about names and everything else. So I'm going to cut this a little bit short. So I'm going to read about like a page more, and I'm going to cut it off. So I'm just letting y'all know, just to say there's going to be a lot more stuff. Anyway, keep it there. Nazi soldiers stormed into the ghetto streets, arresting every Jew they could catch. The dust rays in the ghetto could be seen across the city. Women were dragged down stairwells, beaten, and killed. The survivors were let out past the streetlights. A few days later, a peasant said she had seen the Jews being led into the woods beyond the city. There was a train depot in the forest. The Germans said the Jews were being resettled in the east. This massacre, which emptied the ghetto, was known as the Great Provocation. It prepared the ghetto for its new inhabitants. When an SS soldier told Rocza and Vitka that they had just 10 minutes to gather their possessions, Vitka said, "We don't need it." Unlike most of the other Jews of Vilna, the girls had already lost everything. There was no property to protect, no parents to worry about, no brothers to look after. "We are ready now." The girls walked into the flaring street, their heavy boots crunching over broken glass. Rocza's peasant scarf, tied in her hair, moved with the breeze. She did not know where she would sleep that night. A black sedan rolled past down the street, honking its way through the crowds. At the gate, a driver in a blue uniform got out. He took a trunk down from the roof, opened the back door, and helped out a man in a suit. The man in the suit said a few words to the driver and then dragged the trunk through the gate. "It's a Jew," said Vika. Inside the ghetto, Rocza saw the man sitting on the trunk, smoking. She later wrote of those Jews who set themselves above the others, by wealth, by education. They stood against the mask, making themselves distinctive, as if to demonstrate their lack of affinity, sometimes smiling contemptuously. This group, full of pride and contempt, seemed more miserable than all the other pitiful people. The girls lived at 15 Strassen Street, a house along the ghetto wall. A friend of a friend had invited them. It was a trim, square, 3-story building with a black slate roof. There were 2 bedrooms and a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. The girls lived with 10 other boys. Over time, modesty became a useless luxury, and the girls undressed before the boys the way a girl might undress before her sister. The girls shared a bed in the back of the flat, and the bed was pushed against a boarded window, which softened the sunlight to a dull yellow blur. Rocza was shocked to see the traces of the people who had lived in the house before her. The room was alive, she said. There were pictures of family vacations and letters from relatives, and beds unmade and meals half-eaten. Rocza pretended that these people had just gone away and were now living in another town. But when she looked at the room, trying to build a story from the evidence, he was a loving husband, but she was a dreamer, absent-minded, humorous. She believed only the worst and was filled with rage at the Jews who went on living, at herself for staying in this home that belonged to someone else, and at the Germans who made her hate her people and herself.